The only reason you see that shift is because the level of atrocity is so horrific and undeniable that it's breaking through the propaganda. And that people are just sitting there thinking, okay, well, they keep telling me that these are the bad guys, but I keep seeing children's bodies mutilated. And our brains, through evolution, have tended towards maybe we shouldn't mutilate children. That's as basic as it gets. It's just like the brains of people are viscerally reacting to the horror that they are seeing every day. And so finally something is breaking through, and now you get a majority actually have an unfavorable view. Now just imagine for a moment what that statistic would be if the narrative was not so curated and controlled by the media.
Now, as I said, I wish and imagine that this should be more. And if there had been any reporting, honest reporting about what was going on, and people didn't rely upon the fact that the Gazan people, in their absolute determination, have not shrunk from documenting the horrors and crimes against them. They've shown such incredible fortitude to say, we are going to make the world know about what is being done in done to us, and what you are supporting. That has been absolutely heroic. And although not everyone sees it because they don't have the networks and the access, enough people are seeing it that it has shifted even in the United States.
Now we suddenly have these rallies against Trump with hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even millions of people rallying against the oligarchy which is being led by Bernie Sanders and AOC. I just did that stuff. I'm gonna hold myself in here. That stuff really disgusts me. Where were AOC and Bernie Sanders when the Democratic oligarchy was killing Palestinians en masse? Where were these rallies of AOC and Bernie Sanders when Biden was committing genocide with Israel?
Investors around the world are viewing U.S. Treasury debt as no longer the safest investment for times of crisis. If that continues, then dollar hegemony is looking very weak. It's certainly, as we speak right now, weaker than it's ever been in our lifetimes. So that's a very interesting development, because that source of economic power is at the root of the US's ability to maintain a global military empire and all of the consequences, including supporting the genocide in Gaza, that it includes.
At least the difference is there's no performative kind of we care about international law and human rights, which is what you saw under the Biden admin. To be completely honest, and this could be an unpopular opinion, I prefer the people who are a little bit more honest about it. Like, it was so frustrating to listen to these people talk about, like, people will say to me, like, why don't you talk about the Trump administration as much as you did the Biden admin? I'm like, because the Biden admin pretended to care about this stuff. Because you could point out the Biden admin's hypocrisy when they said Russia is committing war crimes, and then in the same breath refused to admit that Israel was doing it. Trump doesn't care.
They rob you blind and you thank them for it. That's a tragedy. That's a scam. That's why I'm saying this right now. Americans, you don't need a tariff. You need a revolution. For decades, your government and oligarchs ship your job to China. Not for diplomacy, not for peace, but to exploit cheap laborers. And in the process, they hollowed out your middle class, crushed your working class, and told you to be proud while they sold your future for profit. And yes, China made money, but we used it to build roads, lift millions out of poverty, fund healthcare, raise living standard. We reinvested in our people. My family also benefited from it. What did your oligarchs do? They bought yachts, private jets, mansions with golf course driveways. They manipulate the market, dodged tax, and poured billions into endless wars. And you get stagnated wages, crippling healthcare costs, cheap dopamine, debt, and flag wave probably made in China, while they pick your pocket. For 40 years, both China and the United States benefit from the trade, the manufacturing, but only one of us use that wealth to build. This isn't China's fault. This is yours. You let this happen. You let the oligarchs fit your lies, while they made you fat, poor, and addicted. Now they blame China for mess they made. I don't think so. I don't think you need another tariff. You need to wake up. You need to take your country back. I think you need a revolution.
So welcome everybody. Good to have you all here. I wanted to start off by asking Assal your view of the current U.S.-Iran negotiations. We've got opposition coming from the Israel lobby that suggests to me this is good news, but I'm curious to hear your take to see what level of optimism you think is warranted here.
Optimism. We're sort of in a ironic situation where the administration that pulled the US out of an agreement that already blocked Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is now sort of stuck on this messaging of it's confusing what the Trump administration wants to do. And the reason I say that is because, for instance, Steve Woodcock yesterday in an interview with Fox News said that they would want Iran to limit its enrichment to 3.67%, which is precisely what was in the JCPOA. And of course, this then elicited reactions from the hawkish Iranian camp, whether it's pro-Israel or just your general run-of-the-mill hawkish Iranian camp within the United States, especially, where you got these reactions of, well, this is just what he's now taking the Obama approach. And of course, that using that kind of phrasing is intended to discourage the Trump administration from pursuing that path. And so then you saw the language today from the Trump admin and Woodcock himself with a tweet where I think he said something basically that was still a little ambiguous, because he said, this is a Trump deal. That was very important, right? To say this is not an Obama deal. This is a Trump deal. And then to say that it was about preventing Iran from enrichment and weaponization. Those are two completely different things, right? Like, this is the problem in the way that the Iran nuclear issue is talked about entirely. Iran is a party to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means that under international law, Iran is allowed to have a nuclear program for civilian purposes, right? A non-weapons program. Now, you can get into the politics of what the NPT is, the fact that according to a specific world order, there are states that are allowed to have nuclear weapons, and then there are states that aren't allowed to have nuclear weapons. We can unpack that later if you guys would like, but just sticking to these particular negotiations, Iran is allowed under international law to have an enrichment program. Now, the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s tried this like zero enrichment policy, and that's a non-starter for the Iranian side. Logically said, because an enrichment program is not necessarily a weapons program, and under international law, they are allowed to have one. So really, this is just a sort of surrender is what that position in the US is asking for. That's precisely what Netanyahu was saying when he was here last week in the press conference with President Trump. So that's the Israeli position, in part because he knows it's a non-starter for the Iranian side. The Iranians will say, we are allowed under international law to have an enrichment program for civilian applications. So now you see a sort of wishy-washy language coming from the Trump admin. What I would say is the likely reason behind it is domestic politics. It's very similar. A week earlier, there was a lot of discussion about, are these direct talks or are they indirect talks? On the American side, it was, these are direct talks. On the Iranian side, it was, these are indirect talks. And someone actually asked me recently, they're like, why does the Iranian side, like, why does it have to be indirect talks? I said, because of that same domestic political landscape where they don't want to, it's consolidated by essentially hardliners, and they don't want to look like, to their own base, which represents a minority in the country, but nonetheless to their own base, they don't want to look like, they're sort of giving in to the American side. And so they have to at first go in with these are indirect negotiations. It depends on whether or not the American side is actually serious about a nuclear negotiation. The fact that both sides said had positive things to say about the first negotiation means that the Trump admin did not go in with a zero enrichment policy. Because again, Iran would have walked away from that. There's no way that they would have said, this is positive. But in order to feed the domestic side of hawkish Iran voices in the US, you see this kind of wishy-washy language from the Trump administration. In reality, they keep emphasizing the red line is nuclear weapons. That's what they want to prevent Iran from having. And so that would require an agreement that places limitations on Iran. This is going to sound extremely familiar. An agreement that places limitations on Iran's nuclear program and that puts international oversight on it so that there are inspections, certain inspections policies allowing for international bodies to make sure that Iran is abiding by that deal that puts the limits on its nuclear program to ensure that it's not weaponized. So, I mean, on one hand, I would say the optimism is in the fact that it seems like both sides are actually want to get to some kind of agreement. It's in the interest of everyone. I mean, the idea of a diplomatic deal that prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and avoids another conflict in the region is basically beneficial to everyone, except maybe Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's a separate issue altogether. But then that feeds into the domestic politics of the United States. And that's where it becomes important why this sort of stance has often been taken by someone like Donald Trump, who, I mean, I'm not in his head. I don't know what he's thinking, right? And he's a very unpredictable character in general, but it seems like he wants a diplomatic agreement. Based on what he said, based on precedent, based on his actions, based on everything, I think it's fair to conclude that that's the direction he wants to go in. And that's certainly not the direction that the current government in the state of Israel wants.
Mm.
You wanted to say something, Adnan?
Well, I did. I just wanted to ask Assal if, we have to also, we can't, far be it from me, especially on this panel, to psychoanalyze or do a psychological reading of Trump. We can't do that. It's very difficult. But on the other hand, we saw a pattern with the Gaza ceasefire, right? Where it was Witkoff goes, he has harsh words for Israeli authorities, throws U.S. influence and weight around to achieve a ceasefire that then is really just a mechanism for Israel to recover its military capabilities, rearm, and then at an opportune time to begin in a more ruthless fashion with greater, if it's possible, impunity than it enjoyed before, where, you had Anthony Blinken or, Department of State spokespeople having to at least pretend in a very sort of disingenuous way that they actually cared about civilian casualties, for example. That is no longer necessary to even make those pro forma kinds of gestures under Trump. So I'm wondering, is this a kind of a case where Donald Trump criticized Obama's deal? It was a terrible deal, it was a bad deal, and then proceeds when he wins to tear up the deal to be able to basically get the same sort of deal, something rather similar, but kind of declare a victory um, um, and have some political benefit, from that, but not necessarily be committed to it in any serious sort of way. I'm wondering if that's something to be concerned about and how one would kind of evaluate this sense that you mentioned that he seems to want a diplomatic solution. What's really behind that? Is it quick win? Is it, similar to a pattern that we saw in Gaza, or is it genuinely a kind of sense that um, it's not possible to really achieve major geopolitical goals through a military confrontation with Iran.
I will again not presume to know how the man thinks either. It is very difficult to, because he's fickle, like the he might have one opinion one day, and I mean, one day he says very negative things about Netanyahu, the next day he's greeting him and pulling his chair out. So it's very hard to tell where his mind is. And I think in any of these, I think to some extent what you said makes sense, right? The idea of tearing up the Obama deal. I mean, there was very much this, especially in the first Trump administration, there was very much this attitude of reversing everything that had been done by Obama, by vilifying, basically saying everything that they did, and a lot of it was bad, but I'm saying, but everything they did is bad. And so I'm going to come in and I'm going to change all of that. And whether or not, and there's also a tendency that you could point at, which is to not present information entirely factually, right? Just to say, they sort of present things in the way that they think will feed their base, right? Something that looks like it could look like something they could sell to an audience that says, see, this is a victory, or this is a success by the Trump administration. Now, there are concrete things to it as well. I do think that there is, I mean, it's not that you would call him anti-war necessarily, but he has an anti-war stance. He at least has one, and it's part of this America First concept, right? The idea of being America First is, his logic is, why are we being bogged down in these conflicts where we're spending all of our money doing this when we could be doing these other things? So, I mean, there is a pattern of that behavior as well. So it's also, I think there's some credibility to the fact that he doesn't want a conflict, because it's not, I mean, the reality of it is, it's not in American interests. It's not in an American interest. It's not in his individual interest either. It could be in the interest of, arms dealers, the same like sort of war machine that perpetuates constant conflict because it profits from it. Obviously, there are those types of benefits, but I don't know that that's necessarily his mind frame, right? This is a real estate developer. So look at the language he uses when he talks about Gaza. What is he talking about? He's talking about building something. Like, this is the language that he uses because it's the world that he comes from. Steve Witkoff is a like-minded person. And so you get that kind of language too. So what you actually saw, which is very interesting, is Iran's foreign minister Araghchi wrote a op-ed for, I believe it was in the Washington Post about a week ago, before the meeting on Saturday. And in it, one of the things that he pointed to was that Iran was very open to this idea of like economic engagement with the US. And I think he cited something like it's like $1 trillion opportunity, right? So now he's speaking, you see the Iranians speaking Trump's language. That's what he wants to hear. That's what he wants to be able to sell to an American audience, to say, look, not only am I going to get a deal that stops Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and that's what everybody wants to hear, but it's better because we're actually going to engage with them I'm not saying this is what he's saying, by the way. I'm saying this is a potential that at least the Iranian side might be tapping into. Because that is true, by the way. I mean, it is true that there's a lot of potential for economic benefit for US corporations if there is engagement with Iran. There's potential for economic gains for Iranian people in the country too. That has nothing to do with political gains. That has nothing to do with social gains, right? These are different categories. So I'm not trying to make a case for, if this happens now, Iran is a free country. No, but there can be the potential for economic gains. And same for the United States, right? Yes, the US can make economic gains. That doesn't change the sort of nature of the current administration and the political system that we're in. So, this is my long-winded way of saying, I really don't know. I don't know what he's thinking, but I can say we can look at the way that he's behaved in the past, the things that appeal to him, right? Like when in his first term, the first foreign country he goes to, Saudi Arabia, what he boasts about is this huge, over $100 billion arms deal with Saudi, right? He's constantly talking about money, deals. So all of that, I think, very much goes along with his sort of persona, much more so than conflict and war, because he wants to be the deal maker. He wants to end these wars. And that's definitely not going to work if you start a new one with a country that is much larger than most of the countries that we're talking about in the region, has a very large population, has not only a large military. Now, you could say that the traditional Iranian military might be unwilling, and I don't know this, but I'm saying if you argued that the traditional Iranian military is unwilling to fight in this kind of a war because the government itself is so unpopular, that's why they have a parallel military, right? That's why the IRGC exists. And it's loyal to that very state, which maybe the traditional military won't be. So all of these are ways to complicate the picture. And really, we should, if you consider all of that, take the way that the opposition to a deal talks about it. That's mostly what I'm trying to get at, is if you think about this, if you think about how complicated this entire picture is, the opposition to a deal tries to simplify it as, well, the Islamic Republic is weakened. If this is a lifeline, a deal with Iran would be a lifeline to an unpopular government. And they have this fantasy of a very easy solution, the alternative, which is a very easy solution. And what I'm saying is that's not true. So if you want to have a real conversation, then you have to sort of unpack all of this and also think about how, because Peter, you talked about the opposition a little bit. Like, what is the opposition to a deal? I think the very clear thing is if you are a peace activist, if you're anti-war of any ilk, of any kind, then you do not want any country to have nuclear weapons, and that would include Iran. You don't want any country to have nuclear weapons. You don't want any countries to go to war. And to avoid that is in and of itself a significant goal to achieve. And so if this administration can do that, that's an accomplishment.
Yeah, and just to add real quick, another group of voices, very powerful voices that are technically now on the side, de facto on the side of the anti-war voices, are the captains of industry. Because, right, it would already be a bit of a tough sell for the reasons that you just explained to pitch a war in Iran when the economy is on stable footing. But right now, when the U.S. economy is on the precipice, the idea of bombing Iran, where their retaliation options include setting on fire all of the oil and gas infrastructure on the Arabian Peninsula, what that would do to the U.S. economy, in addition to the damage already from the tariffs, the chance of a massive oil shock. So we've got some unusual allies on the on the anti-war side now.
Actually,
Right.
just to add one quick thing to that point, because that's also why you see in the region, you always hear about the sort of rivalries within the region. But what you've seen recently is more alignments on the sort of anti-war front. So whereas back in 2015 and 16, when the Obama administration was negotiating the JCPOA, it wasn't just Israel that they were getting pushback from. It was also Saudi Arabia. Fast forward to 2025, we're in a different situation. Saudi is every state is a different state now, but there isn't that kind of push from the Saudi side, which is obviously an important state within the region, an important partner for the United States.
Mm.
And I wanted to jump into something that you said in the beginning, Assal. I also wanted to. There's another thing I find very interesting to discuss, and I'll ask Adnan that with his knowledge about West Asia as a historian as well, especially about the Trump and the not wanting war kind of question. But I think you said in the beginning something like there are hardliners in Iran that don't want the government to negotiate with the U.S. government. That would be kind of a loss of face, so to speak. And then I think you said, but these are a minority in Iran. Am I correct? Are these people a minority? Okay. So I'm very interested in this question about Iran and its how its politics are seen by the domestic population, because we recently had a discussion with Kevork Almashan, who is regularly on to talk about what's going on in West Asia. And Kevork said something that seems to be a very sensitive thing in the kind of anti-imperialist spheres. According to Kevork, Iran is a bit of a lost cause for the resistance. and he says that since Pezeshkian is running the show, it's doing a shift more to a pro-Western stance. That's his feeling. It's not a hard conclusion, but that is his feeling. My question is, would you say that that kind of, I don't know how to term them, but that kind of liberal wing in Iran that is more pro-Western than pro-resistance, that is maybe less supportive of helping Palestine. Would you say that these people are on the winning hand? Is that a good conception? Do you also see a bit what Kevork says, that for the resistance, Iran seems to become a bit of a lost cause, or do you see that differently?
I mean, I would love to have Adnan add to this, but let me start with this. I think there's two very different ways of looking at, say, a government like the Islamic Republic and the way that it operates in terms of resistance and then its domestic audience. An average Iranian does not think of resistance for the same reason that an average no one anywhere thinks that way. That's just reality. And I think sometimes from an anti-imperialist point of view, we lose sight of the domestic populations in these countries, right? So Iran, because it sort of, especially rhetorically, but also within its actions, stands up to this notion of imperialism, it becomes a bit of a hero to leftists and to anti-imperialists. But not so to its domestic population, which is suffering enormously across the board, whether it's economically, whether it's from political repression or whether it's from social repression. And that is a reality that I think sometimes is hard for the left to digest because they're only thinking of the resistance aspect of it. But if you're an average Iranian worker, that's not what you're thinking about. You're thinking, how am I going to feed my family? How are my kids going to go to school? Is my daughter going to be arrested if her hijab is not on right? These are the things that you're thinking. And rightfully so. That is, again, that's what the average person, I think, in every society is thinking. And so I think we have to differentiate and unpack this a little bit further. Now, you can, in terms of, the idea of resistance, there's also the fact that most states, and the Iranian state is not an exception to this, are acting in their own self-interest. The reason why they would see a pivot, not a pivot, that's the wrong way of saying it, it's not a pivot to the West, but engagement with the West is because they live under the reality of American sanctions. That's just their reality. And we can talk about a multipolar world and we can talk about US empire being on decline. And I'm not saying any of that is not true. It is. But how long does that decline take? And how much do people suffer while it is in fact still by far the most powerful country in the world? As of this moment, as we are having this conversation, that is the truth. No one can stop the US from sanctioning another country to death. No one can stop it. Maybe one day they will be able to, and that's its own conversation, but as it currently stands, that's not it. And so there's a very pragmatic point of view that you have to engage with the United States because they are under sanctions. And the only way to breathe life into that economy, not the only way, by the way, they also suffer from immense corruption within the state, which is part of the reason why. And that's the same corruption you see in the states that we live in, right? Why you have an elite that's quite wealthy and does well when, again, most of the country is not doing well. That's, again, not unique to the Iranian state. I think my issue typically when Iran is talked about is it's always treated like it's extremely unique when its actions are not, right? Or it's treated as if it's very ideological, in the West at least, like it's an ideological, irrational actor, when in reality it's acting very pragmatically at its own self-interest very often. So I think those are the things to consider when we're talking about, is Iran a lost cause in the resistance? Well, Iran doesn't just exist as a state for resistance. It exists first and foremost, as every nation state should, for its own population and is not delivering that. And I think that's where you'll get so much pushback from the Iranian populace, rightfully so. Think about it this way, because I know I will get a lot of pushback for what I'm saying right now. And that's fine. I'll take it. Because think about it this way. How often do you hear Americans saying, why are we spending X amount of billions of dollars on this war or this population? Why are we doing this? Iranians have the right to ask that question too. Like they have the right to do that. And we have to be able to acknowledge those facts and understand those nuances if we're going to have like a real conversation again about any of these things. So that's, I don't know if that helped sort of explain it, but the vast majority of the country is dissatisfied, as would probably be the case. I mean, the vast majority of most countries at this point are dissatisfied because the status quo is not sustainable. I mean, you can take that literally in terms of like Earth's sustainability, like our ability to sustain life for our own species. Like it is just not sustainable. And so there's mass dissatisfaction across the board. And certainly so in a case like in a country like Iran, where there's tons of potential, but they're on top of everything else being politically and socially repressed as well.
Yeah, yeah, well said, well said. And I think we often, especially because many people in the so-called anti-imperialist sphere, especially in the West, have the time to think about all these things that are going on from a strategic point of view, while when you're in the middle of it, you just want to survive. I think that's a very, very good point. And it's such a complex question indeed. The United States is so all powerful, especially with the dollar hegemony. I think that's still a major issue. Um, I'd love to go actually a bit more deeper into this, but I wanted to also ask Adnan a question, and that is about what Assal just said, that Trump at his core is still um, a kind of somebody who's a deal maker and who doesn't really prefer war. That is something that we all actually thought at least before the elections. Many people now actually say, well, Trump turns out to be just a big fat warmonger like the rest of the imperialists. For example, Dmitry Laskaris, a regular on our show, says that it's just as big of a warmonger as any of them. Let's if you see what he's doing in Palestine, if you see what he's doing in Yemen. um, my question is to you, Adnan. How do you see that as somebody who is a historian who focuses on actually that region? And also maybe you can give us a bit of maybe you have an idea also what this obsession is with Iran, of of the United States and the West in general, from a more of an historical point of view. Like what is going on? Why is that so important? So maybe a bit of two questions, but what do you have? What is your opinion on these things, Adnan?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think Assal, probably is far more up on the situation, especially with Iran and in the region. But just one quick thing on what Assal was saying. I mean, I think the fact that there might be some domestic political sensitivity around direct negotiations with the United States for the Iranian kind of like military and judicial establishment. I mean, you just see what Khamenei, said basically. I mean, recently about the negotiations was if they work, they work. If they don't, it doesn't divert us from what we should be doing, which is continuing our sort of progress as a country to be self-sufficient or be strong and so on. And what it suggested was that there wasn't, didn't want to make a public commitment to, the success of the negotiations because they could fail and because, of course, you're dealing in a situation with unpredictable actor who has proved very hostile, ratcheted up sanctions, the maximum, pressure sanctions during the first Trump administration. So, there's not necessarily a lot of value, to demonstrating that you trust that there could be good diplomatic relations. So I think that speaks quite a lot to the problems here of the domestic kind of audience, and also that previous history. As far as that point, I mean, I think the larger analysis is absolutely true. Most people are concerned with daily survival. I guess the only one question is, and I don't know, are people in Iran broadly, and of course there's such diversity in a big, diverse country with has so many languages and ethnicities and orientations and class stratification and so on. Um, is, how much do people feel that the solution, which would be to repair one's relationship diplomatically with the United States, would actually lead to dramatic changes in the economic and social well-being of people in the country? I mean, one of the problems, both of Iran's recent history, but also if you look around the region, um, it may seem that it is not enough to be an ally or restore good relations with the United States to guarantee,
Can I say something?
political sovereignty. Or, in fact, actually, sometimes this can be worse for you. So, that is the only question, it seems to me, that's, a material question for people in Iran to consider is like, how much do they have
And that's
confidence?
exactly the point that Kevork also makes. Hey, he
Can
says,
I
when are
say
they
something, please?
finally going to learn? Yeah, yeah, I'm going to give it to you, Asal. So
No, no,
he,
because I just want to respond to that exact point,
yeah,
though.
yeah, yeah.
Because
And now
because you said
I will
solution.
just finish my very short comment. So I just want people to understand that is also exactly what Kevork meant. Like, when are they finally going to learn? Because being friends with the United States is not going to help you. That's what he usually also says. Asal, go ahead.
So, because we're talking about, do Iranian people think this is the solution? And no, what
Hmm.
many, many, many Iranians think the solution is changing the government. And that's what we're not acknowledging here, right? Like, that's why they have protests. That's why they call for, that's why they say, like, literally death to the dictator, death to the Islamic Republic. So actually, what the 2015-16 is the stage at which Iranians thought, well, if we had a deal with the Americans, maybe that could help things out. Maybe there could be reform within this country. Maybe this will be the thing that helps us. That's why it was wildly popular a decade ago. Very, very popular. It now, would Iranians be happy to benefit economically if there is a deal now and there is sanctions relief? Of course, again, because anybody would. If suddenly you could afford more stuff, you would be happy about that specific result. That didn't mean, and that's why I'm saying this, is I'm not saying that that would make them now suddenly happy, A, with their own government, or B, with their conditions. But they're not saying, the majority of the country is not saying that that is the solution. They have lost hope in the system entirely. And that's why even this now administration of Pezeshkian saw the lowest voter turnout. The last two elections in Iran have seen the lowest voter turnout in its history, because they have lost hope that A, the system itself will reform, or B, to the point that you're making, that somehow the savior of the situation will be engagement with the United States. But they also live in a reality where this is the current government and they do live under sanctions. And if there's anything that could bring any kind of relief, then that would obviously be something positive. But remember, there are people in Iran. Remember, Adnan, you said this, and it's very true. It's a very big country, very large population, very diverse political spectrum. There are also people in the country who do not want a deal with the United States because they actually think that that's a lifeline to the government, right? That's the other side of this. So there are all these competing ideas and thoughts within the country, but if I had presented it with, they think that this is the solution to their problems, that is certainly not what I meant. So I wanted to clarify that and say, no, that's not a solution, because it is proven not to be.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the larger question in the region is, will the United States, and particularly through its kind of proxy power, Israel, that has, such a doctrine of necessary military and political hegemony, in the region, tolerate, I mean, basically that was the doctrine as a result of the shift and the change from a pillar of U.S. policy in the region under the Shah to an absolutely hostile, government. Their calculation was, well, it doesn't matter. I think, it doesn't matter what kind of a government you have in a particular region. These can change. The most important thing is that Israel maintain military dominance and hegemony in the region. And if that's kind of the strategic calculation, I think that's where you find this obsession with Iran is that of course it's because they have a hostile regime, but even changing that regime, I guess my question would be, of course, it's very different from the Syria situation. But there are certain kind of limits, it seems, to what's possible um, for a project of sovereign development that just won't be tolerated, in the context of Israel's doctrine of supremacy, in the region. That is a, strategic principle for them that the United States seems completely wedded to. So that would be, I think, another consideration. So when you say, well, what's their obsession? Well, it's that Iran is a natural, pole of political and economic power in the region because of the fact that it is a country that has thousands of years of history of statecraft, understands, geopolitical relations and diplomacy, has a huge population, amazing natural resources in energy, a educated population that clearly is capable of technical and technological development. I mean, these are conditions that are a threat to, if they have sovereignty, these are conditions that are a threat to U.S. policy in the region.
Right, right, right. So, as this is political therapy session, I do want to shift gears a bit to what's going on in Palestine and how you guys are handling this psychologically and I don't know, emotionally. I always find it very difficult to say as if we are the victims here because we are absolutely not, of course. But yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts about what's going on in Palestine now under Trump. We just saw Netanyahu visit the United States again. He was flying over French airspace and other parts of the world. The guy is not gonna get caught at all. You could say it's a complete degradation of the international system, justice system. And well, now we just heard the news that Harvard suddenly becomes all tough and resistant against Trump. My question is, would Harvard do the same when it was Biden? What was Harvard's stance during the genocide? I mean, it's also so hypocritical in my opinion. Um, yeah, not a specific question, just in general. How do you guys see where things are going right now, and do you see any hope? That's actually a question that I have, and maybe we can start with Peter. Oh, you're muted, Peter.
Sorry. My response is more to the how to keep your head, your psychological health above water. For me personally, given the intensification of the bombing in Gaza, has actually been focusing a lot more on economic developments. We discussed in an earlier show how dollar hegemony is a cornerstone of the U.S. empire, and how it basically inheres in the fact that the U.S. runs massive trade deficits with the rest of the world, but it pays dollars for the goods that it imports, and then the countries that export these goods take those dollars and use them to buy treasury securities, and therefore, you don't get the revaluation of the US dollar that would lower its value versus other currencies and make it much more difficult for the US to run a global military empire where it has to make a lot of purchases in foreign countries. Over the past week, we've seen something that, as far as I know, is unprecedented, a crash in the equities market, the stock market. But usually, when you have a panic and people are selling stocks, they go and buy treasury bonds. Those are viewed as the safest form of investment. When there's panic, you want to buy treasury bonds. But what we saw last week was massive sales of stocks, but also sales of treasury bonds at the same time. So bond prices actually went down along with stock prices. That's a very odd development that usually does not happen, and it indicates that investors around the world are viewing U.S. Treasury debt as no longer the safest investment for times of crisis. If that continues, and that's of course a big if, because things could always reverse, especially, I think it's very possible that Congress puts inordinate pressure on Trump and perhaps even gets to the 67 votes to pass a bill that takes away any authority that he has now, colorable authority to impose tariffs. They might just take that away and then restore stability to the market and stave dollar hegemony. I think that's entirely possible. But if that doesn't happen and Trump continues on his tariff war, then dollar hegemony is looking very weak. It's certainly, as we speak right now, weaker than it's ever been in our lifetimes. So that's a very interesting development, because that source of economic power is at the root of the US's ability to maintain a global military empire and all of the consequences, including supporting the genocide in Gaza, that it includes.
Well said, well said. Well, that's my biggest wish. You know it, since we've been doing this show for a long time. I think I'm personally a big believer in the fact that the only reason why the United States is so all-powerful is because of its structural advantage of dollar hegemony. I mean, it can fund imperialism literally in every corner of the world. And I think the only way to get rid of that is when other countries stop funding the imperialism that is being waged against them by dropping the dollar, and such as China, for example. Um, d- to get back to my bit of a general question about where we stand now, vis-a-vis Yemen, Palestine, Trump, etc. How do you see it, Adnan, going from here?
Well, I don't know. I can own, it's just so difficult to imagine how the people of Gaza who had suffered, 16 months of absolute devastation, had a short, brief period where they might have cultivated some sort of hope that there could be an end to their suffering and the possibility of rebuilding their lives, to be plunged again into such brutal, violence. It's just so hard and difficult to imagine how they are managing to keep their spirits up. This is something of a miracle but I just imagine that they must be reaching some kind of limits here. This is so incredibly intolerable. And I think what's, particularly depressing and concerning is that although we didn't hear so much for so long over this period, uh, of any even remote whisper of dissent in the political class of the West, I felt that they attempted. There were some vain attempts at hypocritical, even as they were rending, international law, all kinds of, conventions of the, liberal order of institutions, and so on. There was a sort of sheepish, ignoring of this because it was uncomfortable to actually face when, it was presented to them. It made them uncomfortable. With this administration, that discomfort isn't even there. And as a result, it seems to have emboldened Netanyahu um, to be able to say things like, such incredible statements of he gets to play the hypocritical figure who pretends to care about the Gazans because, U.S. State Department officials no longer have to pretend. So he gets to manufacture this kind of narrative of, well, shouldn't Gazans be able to leave, be able to leave Gaza as a humanitarian, sort of language to describe ethnic cleansing and genocide. And not a single reporter in that White House press briefing about the Trump Netanyahu meeting could even muster a question about, well, does that mean that you're accepting their right to return and that they can leave Gaza and return to their homes and villages and towns that were liquidated in 1948? In the creation of the Gaza Strip, which never existed as any kind of entity before, but only was created as a concentration camp for warehousing this subjected population that was forced, by the Nakba into this. I mean, this is, I think, what is so difficult to take is that at this point there should be at least enough of an education. And also, where is the resistance? Like you mentioned that Harvard might be taking this stance, and certain elements of the liberal political class, finding their voice now because it's Trump who's managing the U.S. empire and and arming and supporting the genocide in Gaza, which they didn't do, during the Biden administration. But where is that when it comes to the press corps? Even raising a question when the ethnic cleansing and genocide of a people is being characterized as a humanitarian option or choice and disgustingly compared to Syrian refugees and others that they were allowed to leave, but only the Gazans are being forced. And it doesn't even mention the suggestion, of course, is that Egypt should be accepting all of these people, but there's no sense that anyone could even ask the question that why doesn't Israel allow them to return? That's not even contemplate. So I think we're in an even more debased position that I wasn't able to contemplate before, to be able to see somebody like Netanyahu in front of the world pretend to be somebody who cared about the people of Gaza, which wasn't something that he was doing, a few months ago. So I find that extremely disconcerting.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Assal?
I mean, there was the Netanyahu said actually when he was comparing the fact that Palestinians couldn't leave, he's like, we're not holding them in. We're not trapping them. And that sentence uttered by, I mean, the man who individually really, especially over the last several decades, I mean, he's the longest running prime minister of Israel, and over the last 3 decades, basically has dominated Israeli politics. Before October 7th, Gaza was under a blockade, which the International Court of Justice basically said that's an occupation. Like, this is one of the Israeli talking points is, we left Gaza, Gaza wasn't occupied. Of course it's occupied because you're controlling everything. Like, that's what occupation is. And that's exactly what the courts found. Because de facto, when you're controlling it by land, air, and sea, people are not free for their own movement. Like, why is there no airport in Gaza? Because they're not free to move. They're not free to move about. So this idea that, like, we didn't trap them in, well, there's an entire border. Well, actually, really, all of the borders of Gaza is controlled by Israel. So then who trapped them? Then why can't they go into Israel? I mean, the better argument is, why can't they return to their own homes? Because that's where they were expelled from in 1948. But if this presentation, and Adnan, you said it so well, like this humanitarian presentation of, yeah, Gaza, the person who destroyed it is the one talking about it. That's the best part, right? Like, you destroyed it. They live in utter destruction. I mean, one of the things that Trump says when he says, Gaza is destroyed, it's uninhabitable. Again, I've said this before. He's not wrong. He's correct. Gaza is destroyed. Much of it is uninhabitable. But that was done by design. That was the intention behind Israel's actions, was to entirely annihilate Gaza. That is why it is a genocide, right? The deliberate destruction, the physical destruction of a place so that people cannot live there, right? The conditions of life being stripped away for Palestinian existence is by definition what genocide is. And so That was allowed by the Biden administration. Trump came in and is allowing it to continue. But for Netanyahu to stand there and or sit there and say, we didn't trap them, we didn't block them in, of course you did. And no one, that was such a good point. No one asked, well, then why can't they come into Israel? I remember there was actually an interview, I think it was Mark Lamont Hill, who I forgot who he posed this question to, but it was like, well, why don't you just let them, if it's temporary, if you're saying that you just need, while Gaza is rebuilt temporarily, and they will actually be allowed to return to their homes, then why can't they temporarily stay in Israel? This is not even something that people in like Western media will raise. They will not raise this question, even though it's an extremely valid and legitimate question, because they know that the answer is, of course, they wouldn't do that. And the reason why it's discussed in this way where, well, Palestinians should be able to voluntarily migrate. It's not voluntary migration when you're committing genocide. That's not voluntary. It's not voluntary migration when you are destroying everything inside of Gaza. It's involuntary because you've destroyed everything. So, I mean, it's much of the same. I think that's the frustration. Earlier, I think Adnan, you were talking about this sort of, at least the difference is there's no performative kind of we care about international law and human rights, which is what you saw under the Biden admin. To be completely honest, and this could be an unpopular opinion, I prefer the people who are a little bit more honest about it. Like, it was so frustrating to listen to these people talk about, like, people will say to me, like, why don't you talk about the Trump administration as much as you did the Biden admin? I'm like, because the Biden admin pretended to care about this stuff. Because you could point out the Biden admin's hypocrisy when they said Russia is committing war crimes, and then in the same breath refused to admit that Israel was doing it. Trump doesn't care. He doesn't care. He's not trying to implement international law. Like, he's not trying to do that. So you can criticize him for many, 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 many reasons, but he's not pretending to care about something and not doing it. They pretended that they cared. They used that language. They kept talking about, well, yes, of course, everything has to be in accordance with international law. We just don't have any evidence that Israel, a mountain of evidence, but we don't have any evidence that it's happening. Amnesty International says they're committing genocide. We don't see it that way. Human Rights Watch says they're committing genocide. We don't see it that way. The United Nations says they're committing genocide. I mean, it was unbelievable to watch. And I think the frustration that I have in seeing how everything is happening right now, from deportations of students, vilifying student protesters, the campus protests, what's happening to college campuses, to what is happening to Gaza, all of it is happening. All of it was made possible by the Democrats and the Biden administration. They're the ones who vilified the protesters. They're the ones who oversaw a campus crackdown. They're the ones who said chaos, this is chaos and order needs to be restored. They are the ones that characterized those protests as being anti-Semitic and being violent. This happened before Trump. So all of the destruction of Gaza didn't happen under Trump. It's continuing under Trump, but it didn't happen under Trump. It happened under Biden. So, you see Barack Obama tweet something about Harvard and good for Harvard because, they're standing up to Donald Trump. And of course, this is someone who's completely silent in the face of just atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. So it's very hard to be optimistic about where we're headed, because the institutions that were put in place to protect us from the very moment that we find ourselves in were already eroded before we got into this moment. And that's what is making this moment possible. And the very people who made it possible are still denying all of that background. And that is why they don't have a game plan to address it or resolve it, because they still cannot identify their own role in creating it. And I think that is the thing that is the most frustrating to try and digest.
By the way, real quick question. I know we're over time, but I'm honestly, earnestly curious. I haven't heard. What's the name we're calling Trump now? We had Genocide Joe for Biden. What is it Don genocide? Like what's the, I guess there's no term that really.
Geno Dawn.
Geno Donald? Nah.
No.
I don't know. Have you guys heard a good one? No.
No, but if I may jump on two or two very big things actually coming from Assal and Adnan, which makes me super depressed, to be very honest. And I want to hear your opinion about that before we wrap it up. And first of all, you said, Adnan, that the media is just so disappointing, like they don't even ask any critical questions. And I think, like I said, the media has been one of the most not just disappointing aspects of it all. It's been such a perpetrator, to be very honest. And I mean, I don't know if anybody has seen it, but these UN testimonies about the systematic sexual abuse that's happening in Palestine is so harrowing, and it did not get any attention. We're talking about, and I've seen these testimonies in the UN. We're talking about very credible people like doctors and everything telling women and girls are literally being warehoused in halls, stripped of all of their clothes. And the most horrendous sexual abuse is happening against them, with even Israeli citizens being invited to come and have a look at them or do other terrible things. And you still hear somebody like Chuck Schumer talk about the October 7th rapes. I mean, where is the media to focus on this? Because I'm 100% sure if the media would focus on these kind of testimonies, we would have a completely different opinion in mass opinion in the West. And that brings me also to what Assal said, and that's very much related. Now we suddenly have these rallies against Trump with hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even millions of people rallying against the oligarchy which is being led by Bernie Sanders and AOC. I just did that stuff. I'm gonna hold myself in here. That stuff really disgusts me. Where were AOC and Bernie Sanders when the Democratic oligarchy was killing Palestinians en masse? Where were these rallies of AOC and Bernie Sanders when Biden was committing genocide with Israel in Palestine? I mean, what depresses me right now so much is that I am already seeing it. I'm already seeing it. The vote blue kind of shtick is gonna win again during the next election. It's gonna work again during the next election. When I see those rallies, how do you guys see that? I think Peter has a strong opinion on these kind of things. So I'll start with you. Oh, you're muted.
That's okay. I think I'm very confident that my views will be echoed in Asal and Adnan's comments. So I'll just cede the floor.
Adnan?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say I was disappointed with the media. I mean, you can't, I mean, you're a fool to be disappointed. It means you have some hope for them. I was disgusted, and was brought home to me. But what you're saying here really, echoing what Asal pointed out about the absolute responsibility of the Biden administration and the Democrats for where we are. So these, new performative resistance, rallies and so on really are kind of irrelevant. But despite the propaganda, despite the fact that there has been no discussion about the horrific crimes that you were describing in these UN reports about sexual abuse on a mass scale, systematically, in Israeli prisons and detention centers. Despite the fact that none of this seems to break through in mainstream media, nonetheless, there have been recent polls that, I would hope and have wished them to be even more dramatic, but there has clearly been a shift despite the wall of silence, from the political class and from the complicit media blockade against true information about the crimes being committed against the Palestinian people in Gaza, that nonetheless, the majority of people now have in the United States have an unfavorable view of Israel for maybe the first time in history. The Pew Research poll that was published last week, 53% of Americans now express an unfavorable opinion of Israel, which is up from 42% in March 2022. So before October 7th and the subsequent genocide, genocidal assault upon Gaza. Now, as I said, I would wish and imagine that this should be more. And if there had been any reporting, honest reporting about what was going on, and people didn't rely upon the fact that the Gazan people, in their absolute determination, have not shrunk from documenting the horrors and crimes against them. They've shown such incredible fortitude to say, we are going to make the world know about what is being done in done to us, and what you are supporting. That has been absolutely heroic. And although not everyone sees it because they don't have the networks and the access, enough people are seeing it that it has shifted even in the United States. However, that isn't actually good news necessarily. That's exactly what is redoubling the crackdown on the political institutions, whether we're talking about the universities or, the realm of politics of elected officials and so on. Is that because this isn't a democracy, and there's so many issues in which the vast majority of the U.S. populace supports various policies, like socialized medicine, healthcare, Medicare for all, many other things are incredibly popular, but the political decision making of the U.S. government over the past 30, 40 years doesn't reflect what is popular amongst the people. It doesn't reflect the will of the people. And instead, what we have is, of course, an oligarchy. So Bernie Sanders, the oligarchy, it's interesting. I've seen these um, comments that he's made in a meme from since 1992 to the present, where he keeps warning about we're on the cusp and precipice of turning into an oligarchy. And it's like, well, this is the most slow motion, hurtling towards oligarchy, as he warns. Um, so what it proves and demonstrates is that, the public opinion may change, but that isn't necessarily going to have an obvious and necessary and direct effect on the policy, and especially the foreign policy of the United States, because there is a bipartisan commitment to Zionism and U.S. empire. Um, so anyway, I'll just stop there because I've been rambling on for quite a bit, and interested to hear what Assal makes of the latest political gestures.
Well, I'm a huge fan of the media, as everybody famously knows. Um, I think the point that Adnan made about the Pew, what was it, the polling that showed now a majority, 53% of Americans have an unfavorable view of Israel, which is wild given the amount of propaganda that they are fed. But it tells you how egregious Israel's actions have been over the last 19 months. That's all it means. The only reason you see that shift is because the level of atrocity is so horrific and undeniable that it's breaking through the propaganda. And that people are just sitting there thinking, okay, well, they keep telling me that these are the bad guys, but I keep seeing children's bodies mutilated. And our brains, through evolution, have tended towards maybe we shouldn't mutilate children. That's as basic as it gets. It's just like the brains of people are viscerally reacting to the horror that they are seeing every day. And so finally something is breaking through, and now you get a majority actually have an unfavorable view. Now just imagine for a moment what that statistic would be if the narrative was not so curated and controlled by the media. If they were actually giving you correct information and real headlines every day. I saw yesterday, I got a notification on my phone from The Economist, and it said, Russia is still, this is a quote, verbatim, raining down death on Ukrainian cities, raining down death. I was like, I do not recall getting a notification on my phone. A notification is important, right? Because what happens is, it's not just that the media tells the story poorly. It's not just that the headlines are very bad and most people are just seeing this kind of passive information. It's that they're not really even sharing it when the articles and the headlines exist. They're not putting it on social media and they're not sharing it through notifications, right? So you would have to go search in order to find even poor articles. You have to go look for it because oftentimes they're not being shared, and that's where people see things for the majority. Like most people are scrolling through their phones on some kind of social media, or they get a notification and that's how they know what's going on. They're not Googling how many people died in Gaza today. That is not what an average person is doing. And so now imagine if there was actually that urgency and that coverage and that language being used every single day, because you could have gotten that notification on your phone every day for the last 19 months, and it would have been an accurate depiction of what Israel is doing in Gaza. Then what would the polling show? So I'll end with this. Obviously, I mean, for anybody who watches your show, I assume if they've seen me, they probably know that I criticize the media a lot for this very reason. I have a pinned tweet from 2021. And it's very important that it's from 2021 because this is not just about what has been happening in Gaza over the last 19 months. This has been the story for a very long time. The story has never been presented correctly in the Western narrative. It's a New York Times headline that I, put right with like in red ink and corrected. And what I wrote in it, not for the headline, but what I wrote in the post was, if you are not writing the truth about crimes against humanity, you are culpable in them. That was true in 2021, and it is more true today because you are culpable in genocide. There is very real complicity because if you look at, and this is not every journalist, if you look at from, their stories from the BBC, from CNN, where reporters are like, they're resigning, they're coming out and saying, we're not allowed to say the things, we're not allowed to report the truth. We are not allowed to report the truth. That means that there is an institutional problem. There's an institutional censorship that is coming from the top down. And that's why, and it's very, very deliberate, and that is why there is complicity. That is why they are culpable. They're not accidentally using these turns of phrase. It is a deliberate attempt to whitewash a genocide. And that's certainly not our notion of a free press or media. That's propaganda. That's just what that is. And so this is now genocide propaganda, genocide denial, and complicity in those crimes. I don't know what else you could possibly say about the media.
Yeah, just to back up what both of you were saying about the influence of the media, you can see it very clearly when you drill down into that Pew poll Adnan mentioned. And you can see that it's people in the millennial and Zoomer generations that are overwhelmingly having a negative view towards Israel, and people in the generations older than them that have moved in a more negative direction, but are still majority positive on their opinion of Israel. That's the clearest indication of what happens to your brain when you subject it to television, newspapers. That's the message you're getting. Not enough information to make you have a negative opinion on Israel. It's only the generations that use social media more than legacy media that are even incidentally getting some of these pictures that our evolved psychology does not like: mangled children. And there, in those generations, you see the shift in opinion towards a negative one on the Israeli government. That's a very clear indication of exactly what you guys were talking about regarding the power of the media.
Yeah, yeah, very well said. And I wanted to actually show that video today, but I think I will edit it in at the beginning of this show afterwards of this Chinese guy that was a bit of a hype online for attacking Westerners for being so propagandized by their own government, their own imperialist government. He was reacting on the tariffs, and he instead of like blaming China all the time, why don't you guys wake up and see your government ripping you off while spending the money on wars? Very good video. And why am I saying this? Adnan just said, and Assal also, that what is being exposed now is just a complete failure of Western institutions, whether it's the media, the universities, the political class, the justice system, etc., etc. And what I hope, sincerely, and I've said this many times before, and I've also seen Michael Hudson saying it many times, and I saw him saying it again on a recent interview, but he said it also when he was here. I hope that this will finally start making the rest of the world see that the West and its institutions should not be idolized, including Ivy League universities, which are big fat propaganda machine for pro-imperialist theory. I really hope that the Chinese finally realize increasingly more and more that they can just study at home at top universities and be completely fine. Instead of that stupid trend, that colonial mentality that has been around the world, where you have to have a Western degree to get into the top schools. You know, it's the same at our university. It's a very prestigious university in Asia, and you will see there's so many people with Western degrees. And I think this is a moment where you see the hypocrisy of Western institutions. And I hope that this fear that international students are having right now, like, whoa, 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 we are not safe over there. I hope this will actually expose the Western institutions really for what they are. And I think we are right. We are in that moment. And when I saw that video of the Chinese guy, I was like, this young man gives me hope, man. When you saw how he unpacked the Western situation and the way the world works, I was like, yeah, China's up and coming, and if this is the new generation, I have some hope. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I will edit in that video for the audience to see. I will start with it so they have seen it by now. And I just let's end it here. You both have been very generous with your time, Assal and Adnan, and this was excellent. I think Adnan was a very, very good addition to this discussion. Great chemistry, and hopefully we are allowed to include you again in the future, Adnan. That would be very, very, very great. And yes.
I just wanted to say I enjoyed it very much, and it was great having you on my show for a discussion. And I've enjoyed very much being here on BetBeat Media and getting a chance to chat and learn from Assal as well.
Yeah, I was going to say the same, Adnan. I was really happy that we got to meet here, and it was a great discussion.
Likewise, agreed. Looking forward to the next time we chat.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wonderful, guys, and see you next time.
See you guys. You guys have a good rest of your day, and Adnan and I will have a good rest of our nights.
Excellent, excellent.
Thanks.